Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I would like to welcome all of you to the second panel of the 7th Abu Dhabi Strategic Debate. After the first panel touched upon the potential impact of the victory of the President-elect Joe Biden on international order, we continue this panel. In this panel, the second part of the topic by dealing with the potential impact of the new American administration's policy on the regional order in the Middle East. The panel will explore who are the winners and losers from Biden's victory and Trump's loss. The trend of the Biden-led US policy in the region, whether this policy be an isolationist or interventionist, and the nature of the new American administration's policy towards Iran and the rest of regional conflicts and issues. Three prominent experts in the Middle East region will take part in this panel. Dr. Paul Salem, who is president of the Middle East Institute in Washington, Dr. Stephen Cook, who is the Enrico Matti Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, and Mr. William Wechsler, who is the director of Rafiq al-Hariri Center and Middle East Program at the Atlantic Council. I would like to welcome the speakers and thank them for accepting our invitation to take part in the debate and this panel in particular. I would also like to welcome all our viewers who are watching this panel on EPC's account on all various social media platforms, as well as on its YouTube channel and via Zoom application. Before I give the floor to the speakers, I would like to draw the attention of our Arab viewers that they can listen to simultaneous interpretation in Arabic by clicking on the French channel at the bottom of the screen. Welcome all of you, my dear guests, and I will start with a question for Paul and Stephen. How will the Middle East region be affected by the result of the US presidential election? Which regional conflicts are expected to be aggravated, and which one will be de-escalated based on the outcome of these elections? Paul, please.
First of all, it's great to see you, Dr. Ebtesam, and again, salute for all the great work you're doing in Abu Dhabi over the last few years, and hello to everybody who's following us on Zoom and on the social media. I think it's important to put into context the coming months, and maybe between now and the summer of 2021, that the transition from a Trump administration to a Biden administration will take time. First of all, we need to see the outcome of the Senate, a couple of Senate races, to see if the Senate will indeed stay in Republican hands or whether it will switch to a Democratic majority. That will have a big impact on whether the Biden administration has to deal with a Republican Congress and has to be more centrist, or whether it does not have to deal with a Republican Congress and can be more aligned with its progressive or leftist, if you want to say, base. So that's important. It will also take several months for Biden to get his government in place and to begin reviewing policy and making moves. Having said that, it's also important to note that the Middle East is not a big priority for this incoming administration. The US is going through the worst pandemic in a century and the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Foreign policy, certainly Middle East policy, did not figure in the election. The American public is not focused at all on it. And if you look at the Biden administration's transition website, It's all about, obviously, a lot of it about domestic issues. And when they do talk about foreign policy, it either has to do with the pandemic, which is, also a global crisis. It has to do with climate change, economic recovery, things that, are in that nature, or with great power competition vis-a-vis China and Russia. So let's start in that perspective that the Middle East is not going to be, the highest priority for this administration. If you recall, when President Trump took office, the first visit was to Riyadh. You recall one of his strongest relationships is with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel. I think all of this will not be the case in a new Biden administration. It's also important to note that Biden was in the White House just 4 years ago. Most of his team, were occupying positions just 4 years ago. So it's not exactly a mystery. And they've been very kind of communicative. I think the main difference will be in Iran policy. It will not be a copy-paste of the old policy, but Biden has made it clear that he wants to find a pathway to resume or return to the nuclear deal with Iran if Iran complies. He certainly wants to strengthen that deal, and he wants to engage on negotiations on missile defense or the missile program and Iran's interference in countries in the region. That is a difference in terms of returning to the nuclear deal. I think what Biden can benefit from is President Trump has left Biden with a lot of leverage over Iran. There's so many sanctions now that will not be removed as a result simply of the nuclear deal that a Biden administration, I can say, could use in diplomacy with Iran to get a better result than they got a few years ago. On the three other agenda items, I would say relations with the Gulf. I think there will not be that same personal warmth that existed under President Trump, and that the leaders of the region, as well as Biden's team, has to figure out, the dynamics of those relations. But there's no doubt that partnership for economic and energy and security and political reasons with the main Gulf countries will remain and is not going to be greatly affected. On Israel, again, strategic relationship will remain, but it's no secret that Netanyahu wanted Trump to win. So how that personal relationship plays out, we'll have to see. Biden certainly welcomed and will build on the normalization agreements that happened under the Trump administration, which were an achievement, but will reverse the Trump administration policy of breaking relations with the Palestinians. So a resumption of relations with the Palestinian Authority, encouraging the Palestinians and Israelis to resume direct talks, opening the Palestinian Representation Office in Washington. So a return to that kind of policy, although the results might be very limited. Finally, on the war on terror, in fact, there was not much difference between Trump and Obama. Trump continued the war on ISIS and Al Qaeda that had started under Obama. Biden is very focused on that conflict, but he would want the military presence in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria really to be really strictly focused on counterterrorism rather than any wider or larger ambitions. I'll stop there, and thanks again, Ebtesam.
Thank you, Paul. Stephen, what is your view?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ebtesam. It's a great pleasure to be with you once again. I feel like I've been with Abu Dhabi Strategic Debate from the very beginning, and it's a great pleasure to be back. Only regret is that I'm not there with you all, but it is a great pleasure to be with you and to be with William and Paul as well. I'll just echo a few points that Paul made and then add a few things. First, I do think Paul is spot on that it is going to take some time for the Biden administration to kind of fully flesh out what its approach to different conflicts in the Middle East and different countries in the Middle East. These policy reviews tend to take 6 months or more. Although we generally know who the players are going to be, they're still going to go through the process of reviewing policies to determine which direction the Biden administration is going to take. Second, I agree 100% with Paul. The first visit of President Biden will not be to Riyadh. It won't be to any place in the region. I suspect the first foreign visit, will be the same first foreign visit that many presidents have taken before President Biden, and that is to Canada. He will go to Ottawa, Canada, and then after that, he'll go to Europe. And he'll go to those places in order to demonstrate that the United States is back, in a leadership position, and it values its relationship with its traditional partners in Europe and North America, commensurate with previous administrations. Then there is the big question of whether we will see continuity or real change in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And the tendency is to see a lot more continuity in the relationships and in the approach to the region. Although there have been significant swings in American foreign policy from administration to administration in recent years. And let me just take what I think are going to either be changes or continuity. Certainly when it comes to Iran and the JCPOA, there is going to be a change. We are going to move from maximum pressure, and I certainly agree with Paul that the Trump administration leaves the Biden administration a significant amount of leverage in negotiations with the Iranians, but there is going to be an inclination to re-engage with Iran and to seek either to rejoin the JCPOA or negotiate a new one. That is a very significant change from President Trump. It is something that I think that leaders on the other side of the Gulf are going to have to brace for, because this is something I think that is going to be central to a Biden administration's Middle East policy. Second, when it comes to Israel, it is certainly the case that Prime Minister Netanyahu felt comfortable with President Trump. Then Vice President Biden was a witness to the deterioration of personal relations between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu. But we should all keep in mind that both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President-elect Biden have been around for a long time, and they know each other for a long time. There may be a change in tone. There may be a return to American diplomacy with regard to the Palestinians, although the chances of there being any kind of real success in that arena are limited at best. But I do believe that President Biden, who welcomed the Abraham Accords without reservation, and Prime Minister Netanyahu will find a way to work together. I don't think you're going to see the kind of, as we say, oil and water relationship between the American president and the Israeli prime minister that you had in the during the Obama administration. Even so, during the Obama administration, when the two leaders didn't get along, the strategic relationship between Israel and the United States continued, and it will continue to be strong going forward. Next country where I think there's likely to be change is actually Turkey. Turkey is a NATO ally. There's a long list of differences and complaints that each country has with their policies. But I think that the change on Turkey really has more to do with US domestic politics than anything else. And that is to say that President Biden will want to reinforce the ideas that the United States is a country where rule of law prevails and where there are appropriate checks and balances between the branches of government. That directly affects Turkey because the Department of Justice has been investigating the Turkish bank Halkbank since the end of the Obama administration for its part in helping Iran evade sanctions. And there is some evidence of other types of illegal activity that Turkish representatives, possibly members of the Turkish government, engaged in with regard to Halkbank. The Trump administration slowed down that investigation, didn't stop it, but really put the brakes on it. I think it's clear that President Biden, who as vice president told President Erdogan that he could not interfere in this case, that this case will proceed. Second, President Biden is someone who's a longtime member of the Senate, is an institutionalist, and wants to see a healthy checks and balances in the United States between the institutions of the government. That means that sanctions on Turkey may very well proceed for its purchase of Russia's S-400 air defense system. The legislation known as the CATSA legislation specifically directs the President of the United States to apply a certain number of sanctions on Turkey in a variety of areas. It seems to me that as long as the Turks continue to test and deploy the S-400, they are going to be open to the possibility that there will be American sanctions on Turkey. This will be a huge debate in Washington, but the very fact that after the Trump administration and questions about the rule of law and the appropriate balances between our branches of government would suggest that Turkey may be in for a tough time. And then finally, and I'll close here, is on Saudi Arabia. I think that Paul is absolutely right that the personal warmth between the president of the United States and his family and the leaders of Saudi Arabia are likely to go away when President Trump leaves office. And I think that's as it should be. This is a relationship that is important, but it should be institutionalized and it should be subject to a foreign policy process in the United States, not the ability of leaders to text each other and go around the process. Now, there's obviously been a lot of discussion in Washington about what Democrats might do to Saudi Arabia. I certainly think there's going to be a change in tone, but in terms of tangible policy changes, punishing Saudi Arabia for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi or for other transgressions, it strikes me that that may not be something that the Biden administration takes on at a moment when it is dealing with a global pandemic, a situation in the United States where, as Paul described, the worst economic situation since the 1930s, racial problems, and a deeply, deeply divided American public, deeply divided. This was not by any stretch of the imagination the blue wave of Democrats that people were expecting. So I think the president's inbox, as we say, on domestic affairs would suggest that taking on so much in the Middle East is not something that is going to happen. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. William, do you have something here, your take on this issue?
Sure, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this important discussion. Like Steve, I just only wish that I was in Abu Dhabi instead of Washington right now. I'm going to start by just putting a new Biden administration into the context of the Middle East, because when the Biden administration comes in 2021, it is not the same Middle East as Trump discovered, nor is it the same Middle East as Obama discovered. It is a Middle East that is being driven by lots of different factors and lots of different narratives. But the most important narrative, I would strongly argue, of all of them, the one that affects the greatest number of events in the region strategically, is the widespread perception of American withdrawal. And that perception was not just driven by the Trump administration, although it was exacerbated every time President Trump had an opportunity to speak about the Middle East. He always came back to his desire for withdrawal. Even when he was announcing the Abraham Accords from the Oval Office, he couldn't control himself and had to talk about the need to get all of our troops out of protecting the energy resources, their freedom of navigation. But it's not just Donald Trump, it was multiple administrations before, and it's a widespread perception in the American public. Given that that's the most important dynamic, it's actually quite a good thing for the Middle East that President Biden won, because I believe that a second Trump term would have really accelerated that dynamic. Vice President Biden is, as was mentioned before, at his heart, he is an internationalist, he is an institutionalist, he is a classic, he is a person from a different generation, of an older generation of what the long-standing U.S. interests are and relationships are in the Gulf and the wider Middle East. And that's how he will approach these things. But because of this widespread perception of American withdrawal, there's a vacuum that's been received, and many countries have been moving into this vacuum, of course. And there's going to be a lot of conversation at this strategic debate about great power competition. China is not yet part. China's a huge economic reality in the region, but it's not yet part of the geopolitics of the Middle East. It will be eventually, but it is trying to delay that point in time as much as possible. So you've had non-Arab actors, 3 important non-Arab actors, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, moving in to that vacuum as much as they possibly can. You know, in the old days, any attempts by those actors to move in would have to deal with the traditional Arab powers in Cairo, in Damascus, and in Baghdad. And none of those places are in a position to provide the kind of leadership for the Arab world as they once did. And nor are the formal colonial powers, notwithstanding France's desires to play certain roles in Lebanon. So what's left is a growing coalition of countries that had not previously really been large geopolitical actors in the region. And that's the Gulf countries and Israel. That are in a position to block the movements of these non-Arab partners. I think a Biden administration would be wise to encourage this development, that this is something that you've seen, one of the very few policy issues that the Trump administration took pride in, that the Biden campaign and President Biden himself did not have anything negative to say about, was the Abraham Accords and this growing coalition that we're seeing. So I would anticipate that effort to be continued to be pushed. One of the real issues that's going to be on the table, and I'm happy to talk about all of the issues that my colleagues raised about individual countries, but one of the real issues that they didn't raise is one of the other trends that's really accelerated over the last 5 to 10 years is a marked change in the way that certain countries in the region have dealt with the United States. For basically the second half of the 20th century, every leader in the region realized that because their security depended on the good relationship with the United States, that they were better off if that relationship was built on a solid foundation of bipartisanship, really nonpartisanship in Washington, and was based on common interests, common values, common objectives. That is, along with many other dynamics, that has deteriorated over recent years, and in ways that would have been inconceivable really not that long ago. It is very, very clear in Israel and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere who they wanted to see win this election in the United States. And it's not just clear their own desires, but in certain cases, and in particularly in Israel, there's been very active involvement in U.S. domestic politics. The big turning point was when Benjamin Netanyahu came and spoke in front of Congress, working with the Republicans against an Obama administration, which is remembered by many Democrats who don't really usually care that much about foreign policy, much less the Middle East, but they do care about their domestic politics. And so what I would imagine is that a Biden administration would be will offer a return to a relationship based on common interests, common values, common threats, common objectives. But but there will be choices that will have to be made in the region about whether they want to accept the offer on the terms that the Biden administration may propose it, which is a return to the bipartisan approach to U.S. politics and and a reversal of the partisan nature of those relationships.
If I may comment on that, William, I think this is not, I do know that people in the region, they tend to like that personal level and relation with the U.S., but this is not their problem. Also, U.S. Presidential office, it was obvious in Trump, but Bush Jr. also, that was also obvious. So institutional relation, this is also encouraged by the White House, in fact. What I want to also, what I got from your views that Middle East is not anymore priority. But that also, it was since Obama, when they changed their strategic assessment towards the region and pivoting towards China. And that was obvious from that time. But here, do we take the Middle East as monolithic when we talk that it's not anymore priority for United States or even for Biden administration. Well, where is Israel fit here in this assessment? Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be clear a couple of things. First of all, yes, in terms of the US elections and the current US situation and public opinion, of course, all of their priorities are themselves, domestic, and that's very natural. It's also clear that since the latter days of George Bush, the end, 2007, 2008, and of course, through Obama and through Trump, that none of them had the great ambitions that Dick Cheney and the team after 9/11 made the Middle East a priority, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and hoped to completely transform the Middle East, maybe taking the model of World War II, where they went into Western Europe, defeated Germany, and created, Germany as an ally, West Germany. They entered Japan and created of Japan an ally. So we're comparing to a high point, which was 2003 and up till 2006. So it's a recalibration, not a withdrawal. There's no withdrawal from the Middle East. And when, for example, President Trump or President Obama speaks of withdrawal, they're technically talking about withdrawal from the endless wars. In other words, withdrawal from Iraq, withdrawal from Afghanistan in particular, wars that the US started effectively, and a little bit withdrawal from Syria, which they were not at in the beginning. But the US has enduring presence and has enduring interests in the Middle East. One, there is an enduring interest in the economics. Energy, hydrocarbons will remain a key energy component and into the foreseeable future. The US will not give up control of that to Iran or to China. That's not going to happen. So the presence in the Persian Gulf, despite what Trump occasionally wanted to say, that's not going away. Secondly, the focus on weapons of mass destruction, like the Iranians had and like the Libyans were going to have, that is a 21st century problem. The US cannot live with that, so it will not abandon it. The problem of terrorism remains America's #1 national security problem anywhere in the world, competing with China as a concern. So US counterterrorism presence in the Middle East is not going away. And fourthly, the US has very good relations with many, many countries in the Middle East, from Morocco all the way to Oman, and is certainly not going to give those very fruitful relationships up. So we must not misunderstand. There isn't, the US has interest, has a presence, benefits in the region. The US has a major military, economic, diplomatic, political presence. Yes, there is a focus on China. Yes, there's a focus on cybersecurity and space warfare and pandemic and climate change. But the Middle East remains an important part of the US presence. So it's not going anywhere. It's also, I think, something that the Republican and Democratic administrations have learned over the past few years, is that there are very few easy wins in the Middle East. Something that looks easy ends up not being so easy. So there's no excitement to make any big adventures in the Middle East. Obama was able to secure a nuclear deal. Trump was able to secure the Abraham Accords, good achievements. But the ambitions, unlike under the George W. Bush administration, there's no illusion anymore that there are any big, easy wins in the Middle East. So they're likely to focus on other things where there could be actual benefits.
Thank you, Steve. Paul. Stephen, I would like to ask you, how will key regional powers deal with the result of the US presidential elections? Mainly here, I'm talking about Iran and Turkey.
Before I get into that, let me just pick up on a couple of things that both Paul and William pointed out. And I think that Paul is essentially correct, that we have a set of interests that are going to keep the United States engaged in the Middle East. I think that policymakers, though, are interested in aligning our resources with a strategy, as opposed to this kind of sense that we are this power that doesn't have a purpose and doesn't really actually know what it wants in the region, and thus it's been sucked in. And that in turn produces a debate here in Washington about withdrawal. There is something more to the debate about withdrawal than I think Paul is suggesting, particularly among progressives in the Democratic Party. The diagnosis of the problem in the Middle East is the United States, and therefore the United States should leave the region. Given the political configuration in which there is a sense of a rising sense of progressives and a fight within the Democratic Party, and the sense that President Biden owes progressives a something for his victory, there is going to be a continuation of the debate about withdrawal, whether there's withdrawal or not. And my sense is that that debate, that noise, what's being played out in the newspapers, what's being played out in Foreign Affairs Magazine and Foreign Policy Magazine, has an impact on the way in which leaders in Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, Jerusalem, Cairo, and other places view the region. There is a desire, though, to realign our resources to things that are realizable in the region. That's not big wins. But I do think that there's going to be this continuing debate. And there is a general consensus that reducing our presence or doing things with less ambition is likely going to be the way forward for the United States. Now, how are they hearing these things in Tehran and Ankara? Well, let me start with Ankara, because I know Ankara better than I know Tehran. It strikes me that the Turks are quite nervous about what is about to come, for the reasons that I laid out in my previous remarks about the S-400 and the Halkbank case, as well as the long list of geopolitical differences that Washington and Ankara have with each other. And you can see this in the kind of two different sides of the same coin statements coming from people who are part of the Justice and Development Party or close to President Erdogan. And that is, they are saying that in order for the United States to have a good relationship with Turkey, the United States is going to have to adjust. The Biden administration is going to have to adjust. That's the kind of bravado piece of it, along with it saying, you know, there must be the United States, if it pursues a realist foreign policy in the region, there's no reason to believe that Turkey and the United States cannot have good relations. The fact of the matter is, however, is that there are a whole host of issues in which the United States and Turkey disagree, whether it is Turkey's efforts in the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey's efforts in Syria to carve out a sphere of influence there, Turkey's prosecution of its conflict against American allies in Syria, Turkey's dalliances with Russia, its dalliances with Iran, the way in which it has related to opponents of our important partners in the region. These are things that separate the two countries. Then, of course, there is the very fact that Turkey is one of the most repressive countries in the region. There are tens of thousands of political prisoners in Turkey. If a Biden administration is going to change tone and be a bit more sensitive and aware of human rights violations among its allies and partners in and around the region, Turkey certainly has to be at the top of the list. So I think that there is some nervousness. Turkey is one of those countries that had thrown in its lot with President Trump. The difference, though, between, let's say, Turkey and Egypt or Turkey and the United Arab Emirates is that Turkey is also a NATO ally. And that may complicate things tremendously. And there is a big debate in Washington, and a debate that will continue, about whether it is appropriate to take a tougher line with Turkey or to try to reel Turkey back in and rescue a strategic relationship. I think that that debate will take place in a Biden administration, while at the same time the Halkbank case continues and potential CAATSA sanctions for the S-400, unless something dramatically changes in Ankara and they send that equipment back or crate it up and never look at it ever again. When it comes to Iran, it strikes me that this is a bit of a relief for the leaders in Iran, because at least it opens up the potential for dialogue with the United States and potentially sanctions relief. Whereas the Trump administration's policy was continually maximum pressure, maximum pressure. And when there was evidence that maximum pressure wasn't working, the answer to it was more maximum pressure. So there was a constant escalation of pressure on the Iranians that didn't seem to bring the Iranians to the negotiating table, and in fact spurred the Iranians to undertake more adventuresome and more malevolent policies around the region. I've been told for a very long time that the Iranians would run out of options and be forced to the table. I don't think that is the case. One of the things that I would caution a new administration about is that a new deal with the Iranians can be as destabilizing as maximum pressure. That is because you are going to find that there are opponents of a new deal in the region who will have the means, whether it's in Washington and in the region, to try to undo the region. I don't see how the regional dynamics have changed dramatically from 2015 with regard to American outreach to Iran. So I think that the Biden administration is going to have to be extremely sensitive to the views of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel in a new diplomatic push with Iran. There was a sense in talking to people in all three of those capitals that as the Obama administration pursued its diplomacy with Iran, that it was not as sensitive to the needs and concerns of those countries. And as a result, you produced this opposition to it. Again, that is the undoing of the JCPOA or JCPOA 2.0 can also be quite destabilizing. I'll end there.
Well, William, I will continue with you the Iran issue based on two comments from Zarif. After the election, he was in Latin America. Then he said that still we did not get the revenge. We did not get the revenge for Qasem Soleimani. The second one on a Twitter, he said, if I may read it, a sincere message to our neighbors, which means the Gulfists. Trump's gone in 70 days, but we will remain here forever. Okay? Betting on outsider to provide security is never betting on outsider to provide security is never good. A gamble. We extend our hand to our neighbor for dialogue to resolve differences. Only together we can build a better future. So how do you read this, William? That is Biden victory? This is how the Iranian look at it. From my side, based also on Rouhani before the election, he mentioned that the United States has to pay what Iran losses from the sanctions. So this is kind of blackmailing the new administration rather more than trying to have friendly approach with this administration.
Yes, there are windows of opportunity for diplomacy, and those windows open, those windows close, and the windows take on different forms at different times. And the window that existed that the Obama administration perceived that resulted in the JCPOA does not exist anymore. You can't just go back to the JCPOA. It's a different region. It's a different Iran. Iran has turned more tough, more hardline as a result of their experience with the Trump administration, and is likely, given the domestic realities there, to continue that path. I do think that there is an opportunity for, that there are two opportunities for a potential Biden administration. And I'm just speaking, of course, as an analyst on the outside. I have no inside information about anything. But one is a general de-escalation And the second is greater partnership with our allies on the other side of the Gulf from Iran. For all the reasons that Stephen said about lessons learned from the JCPOA and those negotiations, about the need to make sure that America's allies are fully supportive of the, or at least understanding of the direction that that the United States takes on such a critically important issue, and also because last year, I mean, as recently as last year, the one Gulf country after another sent emissaries rushing to the United States, begging the Trump administration to de-escalate, as they saw the Iranians commit a whole series of violence, both against shipping, against US aircraft, and of course, against Saudi Arabian energy infrastructure. So there's a desire to de-escalate, I think, across all bounds. At the same time, the nuclear program is not, the nuclear problem is not going away. There'll be attempt to, I have no doubt, the Biden campaign has been very clear about their desire to go back into compliance should Iran also want to go back into compliance. I am personally a little skeptical about the second part of that story. So we'll see. We'll see what the future brings. I think it's more likely that Iran will overplay its hand for exactly along the lines that you just mentioned. The claims that if we want to go back to the JCPOA, we need to be compensated for all of this. These things are complete non-starters, and I also think that there's I suspect that there's a portion of people, especially around the IRGC, who will continue, what has been once explained to me by an Iran watcher in the US intelligence community as Iran's peculiar sense of symmetry. And they have threatened to take action. They continue to threaten to take action in response to the killing of Soleimani. Of course, if they were to carry out any such threat, any chance for this kind of rapprochement or de-escalation or a JCPOA minus, or a wider agreement, all go out the window in that circumstance. Let's not forget when Saddam Hussein, during a Clinton administration, tried to assassinate the former president, George H.W. Bush, the Clinton administration felt the need to retaliate militarily against that. Should Iran try to retaliate against a Trump administration during a Biden administration, the Biden administration would undoubtedly take it the exact same way.
Well, when we are mentioning that with the draw, you mentioned the issues. Now, you did not talk about the countries mainly, which is that very important for United States in terms of terrorism, be the WMD. But there is two things. There is international competition and regional competition. And leaving the region, okay? Now, you are saying they are not leaving the issues, but leaving the region. Always create a vacuum. And the obvious model here, it comes to my mind, Iraq. When it's been lifted and when Obama withdrew his troops from Iraq, and of course, Iran was there since the invasion of Iraq, since US, but I mean, this is how the assessment in Biden administration with the establishment, be China, be Russia, be Turkey, be Iran, all of them, there is competition to fill the vacuum in this region.
Well, I mean, it is a complex picture. And to comment a bit on, the very valid point that Steve made, that certainly among the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, there's, a lot of talk of a more substantial withdrawal from the region. And there certainly could be levels of, of retrenchment. It's a gray area. But the point I was making, that regardless of the wishes, President Obama wanted to leave Iraq and left Iraq and was forced back. He never wanted to be in Syria. He was forced into Syria. I'm sure George W. Bush never imagined when he took office in 2000 and January 2011, I guess, was when he took office, that he'd be invading Afghanistan and Iraq. So it's more a matter that U.S. economic interests and security concerns, once somebody is in the White House, they impose themselves. So that's where the wishes meet the realities. The issue of competition with great powers and regional powers. For the United States, great power competition, as you know, has become the #1 concern in the national defense strategy and in the global perspective. I was in the Pentagon about a year ago, and they were giving briefings about, how the Pentagon sees its concerns. And they said, we have 3 concerns. I took out my notepad to make sure I didn't miss them. They said, #1 is China. And they said, and #2 is China. And #3 is China. Of course, they were making a point that definitely China is of a different order of concern than anything else in the world. But even there, in that discussion, when we went to the Middle East, and we said, okay, what are your concerns in the Middle East? It was Iran and what Iran is doing and how that affects US interests. It was Al-Qaeda and ISIS and how they affect US national security. It was weapons of mass destruction. And only marginally was it great power competition, that yes, they're a bit concerned about Russia's presence in Syria, but it's not really a major US concern. Yes, they are concerned about China gradually building or being more present in transport, infrastructure, and loans and investment. They're keeping an eye on their naval base in Djibouti, but it's really still quite marginal in the Middle East. It will remain an area of concern. As you know, we know that China leased a port in Israel, and that was a big concern for the Americans. When the Beirut port exploded, there was some concern, here is, will the Chinese offer to rebuild that port? If so, they will get a major port on the Eastern Mediterranean. That's not good. We don't want that. But that great power competition will return to the Middle East, but not similar to what it was during the Cold War, not as the determinant issue. In terms of regional competition, that unpacks into 2 issues. Regional competition is most problematic in states that have failed. In other words, after a state collapses, then you have a problem. Iraq collapsed because the US invaded and removed the state. So we have effectively a failed state, which brings in Iran and Turkey and Al-Qaeda and others. Syria has collapsed as a state because of the revolution. Hence, it brings in Iran and Russia and the US and Israel. Yemen collapsed. So you have, Iran through the Houthis, you have the Saudi, military effort, and Libya collapsed. So the problem of regional competition, part of it is normal to have regional competition. But if you had a stable state system, that would not be the level of problem it is today. Now, what does that mean for US policy? It means not only trying to de-escalate conflict between these various axes, if you want, but also trying to bring to an end some of the civil wars that are in the region. And I would point out that the Trump administration really took very little diplomatic interest in trying to end the war in Yemen or in Libya. John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, made a lot of efforts in Yemen. I would think Yemen is amenable to a diplomatic surge, which would include the United States, but also other players in the region. Saudi Arabia wants a way out. UAE already got out. Yemen needs to be de-escalated, and there's a chance to de-escalate and bring to an end the civil war in Libya. But it requires leadership. It requires a diplomatic surge. Even in Syria, the Biden administration says they're going to try to invest much more in resuming the political track, that Syria cannot be left indefinitely like it is. There's too much suffering, there's too much opportunity for Iran and for other terrorist groups. So I think this issue of competition is quite complicated and is not amenable to any easy solution. I want to end by pointing out, sort of commenting on the Abraham Accords, which were a positive breakthrough in terms of countries that have been looking at each other as enemies for decades, finally realizing, okay, we disagree over some issues, but there we can get over our historical animosity and look for ways to cooperate. That should, I mean, rather than that leading to a Middle East which has three warring axes, that a Gulf UAE axis at war with an Iran and others axes, at war with a Turkish Qatari axis, and have another range of wars, it should give encouragement that the countries of the region, and I would say with US diplomatic leadership, have to look for diplomatic progress. In the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a big economic contraction in the Middle East, can we really afford to have open-ended conflicts, to have a Middle East that is effectively at civil war with itself? I would say we cannot afford it. Abu Dhabi cannot afford it. Riyadh cannot afford it. Tehran cannot afford it. Beirut certainly cannot afford it. Ankara cannot afford it. Cairo cannot afford it. And the US, I would hope, should look at the region as a region which requires more de-escalation and diplomacy, rather than, I think, what the Trump administration was doing, which is picking winners and losers, which is a formula for more conflict. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Paul. Regarding the Abraham Peace Accord, Stephen, how will the US presidential elections contribute to activating the Abraham Accord or Peace Accord? And will this lead to engage more countries in that?
Thanks for the question. I just want to, I keep doing this. I just want to track back a little to the previous question, because I think, you know, if we look back on it, of course, you know, if you play this game, that the sorry state that Syria is in, the terrible state that Libya is in, speaks to the kinds of debates that we're having about the Middle East here in Washington. There is an argument to be made that had the United States been more proactive in Syria, had it been more proactive in Libya, the real tragedy in Libya was that once Gaddafi was toppled, everybody looked around, and the Europeans were supposed to take the first step there, and decided it was too hard, and everybody decided it was too hard, and we left Libya to the demons that Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi said were going to rear their ugly heads. There's an argument to be made that had the United States been more active, that those conflicts may not have played out the way in which they had. But, and this is an important point, that there was already at this time talk of and desire to withdraw, leave, realign American interests in a way that had the United States would leave the United States with a lower profile in the region. Second point to your last question, certainly agree that Paul is quite right. When you have state collapse, you are inviting regional competition, and you're also inviting the competition of great powers. But you don't necessarily need it. You see great power competition, or at least great powers trying to compete with the United States to varying degrees of receptivity from regional leaders. So for example, the Egyptians will say, do not ask us to choose between the United States and China. We're not going to make that choice. Whereas you see the Saudis and Emiratis welcoming the Chinese leader to the region and the Russian leader to the region. These are things that there's a certain hedging that is going on that allows for these countries to see alternatives when there weren't alternatives before. And that's because there is this perception that William talked about, that I've spoken about, that, you know, there seems to be a sense within Washington that we don't have to allow the region to impose itself on the United States. Now to your question, the Abraham Accords. Look, I'm one of these people. I'm not at all convinced that the United States played as big a role in the Abraham Accords as I think the Emiratis, the Israelis, and the Bahrainis want President Trump to believe. I think the United States is really paying the bill. I think it's a positive. I think it's overall a positive accord, despite problems that are resulting. The fact of the matter is, I think that President-elect Joe Biden welcomed the Abraham Accords and will certainly not interfere with their implementation, will certainly make it possible for their implementation, and certainly will look for opportunities to expand the circle of peace in the region. All that being said, there was, although Vice President, now President-elect Biden, didn't say at the time, there were people who had served at senior levels of the Obama administration who, made a point of suggesting that the Palestinians were left behind, and that they, despite, how positive this may be, that there really does need to be some attention paid to this issue, because this issue is a source of instability and problems in the region going forward. So you can expect that perhaps, despite, I think, the limited opportunity to see real progress there might be a renewed emphasis there. I don't know how I got from regional competition. Oh, Abraham Accords. I'll just stop there before I continue to go on and on and on and on. Thanks.
So, William, the same question, but here I will ask you, do you think now the two-state solution, it's hard to be re-put again on the table with Biden administration? William, you are muted.
Sorry about that. I think that the two-state solution is the only thing that's actually a solution. All other things that are presented as a solution are not actually solutions. Whether there is an actual opportunity right now for the kind of holistic answer to the problem, I'm very skeptical of. Three administrations, US administrations. Bill Clinton spent a huge amount of time on this. Condi Rice spent a huge amount of time on this. John Kerry spent a huge amount of time on this. It was all under frankly, the Palestinian narrative that Oslo and incremental progress wasn't getting us where we wanted to go. And so you needed to go for a holistic, complete solution. And it's all failed. I don't think a fourth time will succeed in this. I think it's going to take generational change in terms of leadership in the Palestinian Authority and leadership in Israel. If you have that assessment of the situation, then the Abraham Accords are actually a positive for the Palestinians. It's not the assessment that many Palestinians have, who famously call it a stab in the back and everything. But if you have that assessment that I do, then the Abraham Accords were very good for two reasons. One, they took annexation off the table, and annexation would have been a disaster for everyone, for the Palestinians, for the region, for Israel. It would have been a disaster. And thanks to, I agree with Stephen, it wasn't an incredibly well orchestrated Trump administration plan to get to the Abraham Accords. But once the Trump administration's plans had driven them into a hole with annexation, the UAE came forward and gave a way out of that hole, in a way that was beneficial. And so that was beneficial to the Palestinians. But the other thing that is going to be beneficial over time, if you believe like I do that this is a generational issue, is the more that people from the Gulf go to Israel for all of this is going to be a warm peace, not a peace just among security services. This is going to be a business-to-business peace and a people-to-people peace. Everyone in the UAE and Bahrain and Israel says that. That means that there's going to be a lot of people from the Gulf that are going to be going to Israel. All of those people will see the plight of the Palestinians firsthand. There will be more pressure over time on the leaders in the Gulf to become more actively engaged than they had been before, because quite frankly, they were not tremendously active in the nuts and bolts of the diplomacy, not nearly to the degree that they could have been in the past. And as trading relationships get stronger and stronger between the Gulf and Israel, Israel will have something to lose at the end of the day. So my hope is that the forces that have been set in motion over a longer period of time with the Abraham Accords will, in the end of the day, help set the conditions for a two-state solution when the time is appropriate.
So we can say that deal of the century is gone with the wind?
I think, Prime Minister Netanyahu, for his own domestic political purposes, will never be able to admit that annexation is off the table. But as long as the situation stays the way that it does today, as long as the Abraham Accords are in effect and positively seen, as long as there are no other wild cards that come in changing the dynamic between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it's nearly impossible to imagine any Israeli government proceeding with annexation along the lines that Bibi Netanyahu proposed. That's my view.
Well, Paul, you talk about the access in the Middle East. Are we going to witness the emergence another new axis in the Middle East, which is include US, Israel, and the Arab countries that concluded a peace deal with Tel Aviv?
Well, I think that axis kind of already exists. I mean, these are both allies of the United States, certainly Israel and the Gulf countries. The fact that some of them are now working together, obviously you still have some that don't have that same situation. I think given that they're both partners and allies of the US, that strengthens the US hand politically and security-wise and intelligence-wise. The point I was making, 2 points. I agree with with Steve and William that the achievement really was Abu Dhabi's achievement. I think it's relevant that the Trump administration and Jared Kushner proposed what they called an outside-in approach. They put it on the table. Why don't you make peace first, and then we'll deal with the Israelis? But it really was a bold UAE step. And it's not the only bold thing UAE leaders have done. I mean, that's how they do things. My point that I was making is that bold recognition that countries in the region and economic countries in the region have to get over suspicion, hostility that are decades old and find a way to cooperate. That's a brilliant breakthrough for the 21st century. My concern is if this breakthrough between some Arab states and Israel is used to simply then pivot and wage some other wars against Iran and Turkey and have 2-3 decades of a different configuration, that now Israel is on our side and now we can, rather than start another round of conflict, to use this insight to find a way, with US help, I would say, find a way to de-escalate conflict with Turkey, find a way to de-escalate conflict with Iran. None of this is easy, nor was peace with Israel easy. It also means addressing public opinion in those countries and having the boldness to recognize that we have to find a way forward. I also find that it's a point of maturity, maybe from Abu Dhabi and some of the Gulf leaders. For most of the last 30, 40 years, we behaved like the young child, that Baba America will deal with Israel for us. Baba America will deal with Iran for us because we're afraid of it. And I think it's a sign of maturity that the US is not going to deliver. It didn't deliver Israel. Things just got worse and worse. The things it did against Iran have an impact, but didn't solve the problem. And recently, we now have a problem with Erdogan and Turkey, and the US is not going to solve that problem either. So I think it's a sign of maturity that we have to go from being the little brother to being, this is our region. We have to figure out how to move forward with it. And okay, if there's a role for the US, fine, bring it in. So I would hope that we move in that direction. I have no illusions. I don't really see how the current leadership of the Islamic Republic can get to anywhere that is reasonable. But that is the nature of historical problems. The problem with Israel was not easy and remains not easy. You have a whole Palestinian people that's been disenfranchised, and that hasn't been solved. So that's what I take away from the Abraham Accords, especially we're entering the third decade of the 21st century. It's going to be a very difficult century for the Middle East. Of course, we have a pandemic, which reminds us that while we're busy doing politics and arming militias and doing no matter what, disasters of a global scale happen. We're reminded that our economies are very, very fragile. We were reminded by that because of the contraction of general economic activity because of the pandemic and because of the complete collapse of oil prices. Looking forward, hydrocarbons are not going to be the way forward, and that's not going to work. We've also begun to feel the serious impacts of climate change. Now, people like to ignore that, like they used to ignore warnings about pandemics, that, oh, that never happens, it's never going to happen. There are going to be big parts of the Middle East that are going to have to be evacuated. There's big parts of cities that have to be rebuilt. There's water resources that are going to be, Sana's water is going to run out of water. Water patterns, rain patterns are changing. So as leaders and societies in the region, rather than live in decades old and centuries old hostilities and enmities and conflicts, which is such a lose-lose proposition, we have to move to a more proactive thing. And it's not enough to say, well, he started it, or it's his fault and not my fault. We're all in this together. The Middle East, as I said, is in civil war. And in civil war, everybody has to stand up and begin moving forward. So I hope the Abraham Accords are a signal in that direction and not just a new alliance to wage old-fashioned proxy wars.
Before I move to Stephen, I have a comment on what you say. You and me, we've been to many track two with the regional powers in the region, and always we are stuck on CBM and blaming game, and we end with nothing. Although this is a non-official level, and you have this is imbalance of power in the region, and that's what make the regional powers look to others from hegemonic angle, okay? And like Iran, which is with its initiative, it make the Iran in the center of the gravity in the region, and the others should follow. Also Turkey. So if we didn't solve this, we will not reach what you are mentioning, Paul. In terms of Abraham Accord, Stephen, you wrote something not optimistic. What is your take here?
I wrote something. I've actually been quite optimistic about the Abraham Accords. Let me just say a couple things, and then I'll lead into the Abraham Accords. Once again, I this is such a fascinating discussion that again, I wish I was in Abu Dhabi so we could continue it after our time is up. It's really one of the interesting developments in the region that for 35, 40 years, the United States has been trying to drive a strategic consensus among Israel and its other partners in the region. And now we're there. The question is, what are we going to do with it? And that's the question that Paul is raising. Are we going to do it to encourage a region that is more prosperous and peaceful, or are we going to withdraw from it and leave the region to itself? And my fear is that if we do withdraw, or the perception that we're withdrawing, that these three different axes will take matters into their own hands and create problems. That's not to suggest that the United States is omniscient and is all wise on these things, but that it has played an important stabilizing role. Although I don't share Paul's, I sense a little bit of optimism on his part about the ability of states right now that view each other with tremendous distrust with regard to Iran, tremendous distrust with regard to Ankara, and what those two countries separately are trying to do in the region, that we can somehow forge some sort of grand bargain in the region. But at least the United States can play a stabilizing role in some modicum of stability by being there. Now, in terms of, and we do, and one of the things, just one last point on this, revisiting a comment I made before, unless we're very careful about re-engagement with Iran and a new deal with the Iranians, we will have driven a strategic consensus. Some of it done by the actors in the region themselves, to their great credit. Great credit goes to Abu Dhabi for this. But unless we're careful about a re-engagement with the Iranians, should that come to pass, we will be outside of the strategic consensus that we have worked so hard for so many years to try to create. Now, on the Abraham Accords, I think that it's to the great credit of leaders in the region. I think that expanding the circle of peace is very important. I do think that the Palestinians are left behind and their suffering continues. I think they've made some very bad decisions since the signing of the accord. At the very least, they could have taken it up and said to the Emirati leadership, okay, you've made this agreement. You have, as you have said, stopped annexation. Now help us negotiate with the Israelis on something. And instead, they and their supporters around the world were hostile to this, rather than seeing it as a point of leverage to be used to potentially seek some redress. One last thing on the Abraham Accord. So I think overall, and I've written about this as well. I wrote about that point and I've written about this. I think one of the really extraordinary things about what the Emiratis have done through the Abraham Accords, and I'm not just saying this because I'm your guest, Dr. Ebtesam, and I've always been welcomed in Abu Dhabi, is that I think one of the real achievements is the normalization of Judaism and Jewish people in an Arab country. That if we are going to move towards a more peaceful existence in the region, and there's going to be less of the bad news out of the region, that the kind of normalization of Judaism and tolerance that the United Arab Emirates has undertaken, both prior to the Abraham Accords and since, I think is an extremely important aspect of the Accords. The United Arab Emirates does not have a history of having a large Jewish community like Egypt or Iraq or other countries in the region. And so as a result, it can help actually, without having that history and it can help try to create a positive dynamic in the region with regards to that. And I think that that's extremely important. And I think it's deeply appreciated by Jews around the world, I'm separating them out from Israelis. And I think that gives the United Arab Emirates a certain amount of leverage that they can actually use with the United States and Israel going forward, because there is a tremendous amount of goodwill. I know that your ambassador here in Washington spends a lot of time now dealing with invitations from Jewish groups from around the world who want to engage in this way. And I think it's very, very positive.
Thank you, Stephen. William, regarding JCPOA, do you think that this new version of Biden administration, they will engage the Gulfists whom they were absent from that, and they will take in their consideration the concern of the missile range and of course the regional files, the Iranian expansion in the region, which was not included in that. I mean, how is this new version it will look like?
I suspect that a Biden administration will take a hard look at the experiences of both the Obama administration and the Trump administration to learn, who had very different approaches towards Iran, to understand what worked in each case and what didn't work in each case. The reality is that the Obama administration's approach to Iran had meaningful positive impact in terms of Iranian's nuclear program. That is indisputable. The downside for the Obama administration's approach is that it helped create a stark division between the United States and its traditional partners on the other side of the Gulf and in Israel. On the Trump administration side, the positive side of what they've been able to do with the maximum pressure campaign is to provide enough pressure such that it does appear that there are some limitations being made on Iranian freedom of action and more generally political isolation, and calling greater attention to Iranian malign behavior around the region. The downside of the Trump administration's approach is that they never had a clear goal of what maximum pressure was for in the first place. Some in the Trump administration wanted it to just restrain Iranian, more sanctions made it more difficult for Iran to do its malign behavior. Some aspects of the Trump administration wanted to, including, I would argue, the President of the United States, Trump, wanted it to set the stage for a better negotiation of a JCPOA, and others in the Trump administration wanted regime change. And the challenge, as best as I see, is because that internal division within the administration was never really resolved in any systematic, strategic way. The way that the maximum pressure campaign was rolled out didn't have, you roll out the campaign in a different way depending on which your different objectives are. The way that it was rolled out was more in line with those who favor regime change. And I suspect that the Biden administration not only won't, but it can't get rid of all the sanctions in one fell swoop at the beginning. It would be a silly diminution of the leverage that was talked about previously that the Trump administration gives them. And also many of those sanctions are not about the nuclear program at all, but about other kinds of behaviors that continue to this day. But I do suspect that they will look at that and identify areas in which they can adjust the sanctions to allow for a chance for those negotiations to take place. Now, as I said previously, I'm a little bit skeptical about where Iran is on this. It always takes two to do any of these things, and we will see. We will see what this happens. And the same thing goes to what Paul said previously. I completely agree with Paul that the region will be a much better place if all of the various cleavage lines, people work towards de-escalation of those various challenges and avoid continuing wars. There's no one that can disagree with that. The challenge, of course, is the same challenge that I just mentioned, is both sides always have to have that same view. And it's not clear to me that that's given the behavior in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon and in Yemen, that is the Iranian view about what their objectives are in the region is a peaceful cohabitation of people. It's not clear that that's the view of what Turkey thinks in the region. I know it's not the view of what Russia thinks in the region. Russia has been very clear in the way that and very successful in the way that they have advanced their interests and their policies, and not just in Syria, but more widely across the region and especially across the Mediterranean. So I do think that there is a utility of in an environment where the United States is not likely to be the sole actor on the other side the way that it was decades before, but where the United States can still play an incredibly critical, indeed indispensable role of bringing together groups of countries that want to work together in a way that is different than the way that they worked in the past in order to meet these common objectives, and in doing so, achieve that de-escalation that Paul so rightly desires.
Thank you, guys. This is a wonderful discussion. Before we end, I would like to give each of you 4 minutes to reflect his ideas based on our discussion. Paul, please.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize maybe something that is being emphasized in the Biden administration, the incoming administration, might be emphasized in the Middle East as well. That the Biden administration, as I said, is coming to a country which is suffering at this huge pandemic, a huge economic contraction, very deep racial conflicts, as Steve reminded us, a country that's really desperately in need of attention, of reform uh, at the health level, economic, social, cultural, less so sort of political per se. Uh, I think that will also bleed a bit into Biden's foreign policy, that it will not only be about geopolitics and U.S. kind of hard interests, uh, but also a realization that if our societies are going to make it through the next few decades, it's not only about who has an S-400 and who has a militia where and who has an F-35. It's going to be about, is your society resilient? Is your health system strong? Is your economy inclusive? Is society, women and others, empowered and included so that we can build better futures for ourselves? That kind of thinking, which I know is very much in the thinking of the UAE leadership, because that's how they view politics. They see politics as a means to making a better life for people. And I know that's a big part of how they view the outreach to Israel, that this is a vibrant economy with amazing know-how in education and health and science and technology and cyber and artificial intelligence, and that our societies all need that. So in a way, I mean, Steve maybe commented that I sound optimistic. I'm not optimistic. I'm very realistic. I grew up in the Middle East, without getting into where Lebanon is now and all of that. But I also know that politics is about purpose. Politics is about vision, about where do you want to go. And so what I'm talking about is visions, is ambitions. Do I think they're going to happen? Probably not, because I know the Middle East but sometimes breakthroughs happen. The Abraham Accords happened. Sadat changed minds. Do you think it was easy between Egypt and Israel, that everybody was, had good relations and their track 2 meetings were going so well that, was easy for him to do what he did? No, he saw a problem and he looked for a desperate, an extreme way to try to fix it. The history of modern Europe, Europe was much worse than the Middle East was, if you take Europe between 1914 and 1945. But a few, 2 or 3 leaders from Germany and France in the middle of World War II woke up and said, this is crazy. What kind of Europe are we building here? 80 million killed, extremism, a disaster. They realized that they needed a vision. And despite millions killed and the devastation that Germany and France and other countries wrought against each other, much more than what we have today in the Middle East, they were able to move forward. So what I'm talking about is that politics without a vision is just politics. And to my mind, that's really not politics with a big P. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Stephen?
Thank you. Just a couple of things. I think it's important as we close to recognize that the Middle East remains important to the United States. And I think that there is a growing consensus in Washington that it's not, but it is. I think it's the most important thing, given that dialogue about withdrawal, retrenchment, realignment, however you want to define it, the most important thing for President Joe Biden is to articulate what is at stake for the United States in the region. I don't believe that the American people understand or know what is at stake for the country in the Middle East. And I think that that is one of the reasons why the idea of ending forever wars, which is really just a political slogan, has become so popular, particularly among supporters of both President Bush as well as those on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. I want to leave that vision thing to leaders in the region. Sadat was of the region. Those European leaders who built the European coal and steel community, which became the European community, which became the European Union, they were of the region. The folks who devised the Abraham Accords, they were the ones with vision. I think that the United States needs to craft a policy that brings an end to our ambitions and is realizable. Our ambition should be realizable policies that help drive a strategic consensus in the region, that help political stability the best that we can. But our ambitions of remaking the Middle East, grand bargains in the Middle East, have not worked out well. I think the leaders and people of the region are wiser than we often give them credit for in Washington. So our goal, we have a lot at stake. We should not leave, but rather than bringing our grand plans to the region, we need to be there to support the kind of stability so that people can realize their own visions. Thank you.
Absolutely right. Instead of giving them fish, teach them how to fish. William, please.
Sure. I'm going to close with by agreeing with one thing each for my colleagues on this, and leaving with two messages for folks in the region. First, completely agree with Paul's comments that he said at the very beginning about the enduring U.S. interests in the region. Those interests do not change by administration by administration. Sometimes the United States policymakers are better at recognizing them than others. Sometimes the American public, well, quite often the American public doesn't recognize them, but they don't change. That doesn't matter. They are there, and they will be there. I'll also agree with Stephen in that the way to advance our interests and protect our interests is to avoid U.S. withdrawal. I mean, this would be an absolute disaster for the region. It would be an absolute disaster for the United States. Even the perception of the coming withdrawal is already causing great problems in the region, and it's something that we need to avoid. And I'll also agree with Steve in that the chances of that withdrawal are more significant given where the American public is and where a lot of parts of our policymakers on both sides of the spectrum, not just on the left, on the progressive side, but also it wasn't just talk from President Trump. And President Trump talks for lots of people on the Republican side as well. And it's something that withdrawal we need to avoid. So with that, I'm going to leave with two messages. And the first message is, of all of the outcomes of all of the people that were running for president of the United States in the Democratic Party, or the potential for Donald Trump to be reelected, but the very best for this issue is Joe Biden. Without any question, he is a long-standing internationalist, institutionalist. This is, he understands these issues. He's dealt with them for literally decades out of class. He is not the kind of person that would just go down the road to a haphazard withdrawal, the way, say, the British did in 1971. And that needs to be recognized in the region. The second thing is that this makes it's a really important opportunity for those in the region, because if the folks in the region, and especially in the Gulf, can establish a modus operandi with the Biden administration about what the right kind of rebalancing of roles and responsibilities are to protect our common interests in the region, how we can both project our common values, which will be much more important to President Biden than, say, President Trump. If they can do it in this situation, then they may have really set the stage for a long-standing new understanding of the Americans' role in the region. If on the other hand, we fail to get that kind of understanding, it may be the last shot that we got at this. And so given where both parties are going in the United States. So that really needs to be the front for those of us who care about the Middle East, who care about the Gulf, who care about America's role in the region. That needs to be the #1 thing on our agenda.
Excellent. That was terrific discussion. Thank you, Paul, Stephen, William. Thank you very much. I'm honored to have you. And I thank our viewers as well. They absolutely benefited from this discussion and from great ideas which we discussed here. And I wish, and inshallah, as Biden said, welcome you here in Abu Dhabi next year, ADSD, and not virtually, but in reality. We miss you all this year, but for sure, we will have you with us next year. Thanks a lot for it.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Ebtesam.
you.
Hope to see you soon. Salamat.
Thank you. Thank you.
Arabic in an American presidential debate, you win, right?
Thank you. You
Have a nice evening in Abu Dhabi.
Thank you. Assalam. Thank you.